Good evening.
And that is the end of the vice presidential debate right there. What a difference a week makes. Two very different personalities on the stage tonight. They showed their personalities throughout the debate, both by what they said and didn't say, how they reacted when their opponent was talking. Both candidates likely more effective in attacking their opponents than defending the records of their principles. Some informed questions from the moderator, Susan Page, but the candidates often ignored her when they were answering the question, didn't answer those questions at all. Kamala Harris scoring on the coronavirus, healthcare, and Russia. Mike Pence trying to steer things back to the economy and taxes. And David Muir, you're here. You said at the beginning, coronavirus front and center. It was.
Yeah, it is the backdrop of what we're going through in this country and the prism through which we're looking at all of these issues. And as you said, George, for the millions of Americans who wondered what last week was, where was the debate, they got a debate tonight. There was a stark contrast, I should say, on taxes, climate change, Supreme Court. But as you mentioned, pandemic right out of the gate. And you heard Senator Harris say the American people have witnessed what is the greatest failure of any presidential administration in the history of our country. That was her first line out of the gate tonight. She talked about the 210,000 lives. She talked about the audio of the president acknowledging that he knew that this was lethal and airborne, which we have been reporting on just in recent days with CDC guidance. And why did the American people not hear this from the Trump-Pence administration far earlier than the March date that she cited? You heard what the vice president said in response, and we knew this would happen going into this debate. He has defended President Trump. He's been very effective in his role as vice president in that way. He said President Trump put the health of America first. He talked about suspending travel from China, had mentioned what Joe Biden has said about that in the past, and he pivoted to the future on vaccines. And the question then went back to Senator Harris, will you take the vaccine if there is one by the end of the year? She said, if Dr. Fauci and the other doctors say, take it, I'll be first in line. She said, if Donald Trump tells me to take that vaccine, I will not take it.
Lindsay, Dave, you said at the start, which Kamala Harris will we get, the prosecutor or not? Did we get it?
Not as much as I thought. I mean, I think it was part prosecutor, part fact check, part presidential interview. At the same time, she allowed Vice President Pence to be rather evasive and not necessarily answer the questions as he was asked. At one point, he was asked about health care. He answered about the Supreme Court. He was asked about China. He answered about NAFTA. And yet it was Pence who actually really held her feet to the fire. At one point, he said, I just want the record to reflect she never answered the question. He was referring, of course, to the Supreme Court. One thing I thought was interesting, in 2016, there was an analyst who said that the VP debate at that time, the matchup was like Miracle Whip versus mayonnaise. I think that was not what we got at all tonight. I think that Kamala Harris was rather spicy. And fortunately, this was more about policy than it was personality.
No question. They covered a lot more policy ground. Again, did not necessarily get all those questions answered over the course of the 90 minutes, but many more topics were addressed. And before we get to more on that, I do, though, want to bring in Dr. Jen Ashton, because it was all over social media during the debate. A lot of people noticing that Mike Pence appeared to have some kind of pink eye. What did you notice?
Well, George, you're not going to be surprised to hear me say this, but of course, no one can make any diagnosis over TV. But what do we know about ocular or eye manifestations in COVID? It has been reported, even though it's limited in the medical literature, that anywhere from 11 to 30% of COVID positive patients can have pink eye. It can be an early sign, but George, he also could have just had some makeup in his eye.
Right, so we've put the questions to the Vice President's office. We'll see what they say about that. Meantime, I know Mary Bruce and Rachel Scott are in the hall. Mary, what are you hearing from the Kamala Harris camp?
Well, the Kamala Harris team, the Biden campaign, feels that she had a strong debate performance here. There's no surprise in that. They say that what was clear tonight, one aide telling me, they feel that Pence failed to make an argument for a second term. They say that he brought nothing new, saying it was just smoother and incomplete sentences, saying that folks at home aren't buying it. And George, I have to say, what simply was most striking, having been in the room last week and here tonight, was just how normal this felt. It felt like a normal traditional debate, despite the very unusual circumstances here. Seeing the two of them separated by that plexiglass, all of us here in our masks, the level of civility. There was a low bar for it after last week's debate, but it just was astounding straight off the bat. And also what felt very normal about this was how so often they simply didn't answer the questions. Both of them often dodging, refusing to answer simple yes or no questions at points, often referring back to their talking points, and how much of this debate did become about a fact check. That is something that Kamala Harris was trying to avoid, not spending so much time debating what really is true and is not with Mike Pence. He was able to successfully drag her into some of those conversations. And of course, those notable dodges from both sides. Kamala Harris still not giving a clear answer on the question of packing the courts. Mike Pence still not giving a clear answer on the question of health care and their plan to continue to protect pre-existing conditions.
Right. Will that plan be coming? Rachel Scott from the Pence camp?
The Pence campaign is very happy with how the vice president did tonight. And I think one issue that they are critically focused on is obviously the economy. This is a sticking point for a lot of the president's supporters out there. And our latest ABC News Washington Post poll reflected that 52% of Americans approve of the president's handling of the economy. We saw the vice president turn back to the issue of the economy multiple times when he was dodging key questions about the pandemic and on other issues as well. That is a big issue for the president's supporters, one that they want voters to keep in mind as they head to the polls. They want voters to remember that they think that President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence, they are the ones that can recover this economy, that can bring it back. But of course, George, there are 26 million Americans that still are unemployment or still are on unemployment tonight, and that's going to be such a critical issue ahead of the election.
Rachel Scott, thanks very much.
And that concludes the first and only vice presidential debate from Utah, in which we know that the plexiglass in between them did not stop the interruptions of either the moderator or the candidates. Kamala Harris coming out strong in the beginning, noting that the way the administration had handled the COVID crisis was the greatest failure of any presidential administration in the history of our country. And then Mike Pence coming back tough as well, essentially accusing the Biden's plan of being exactly the same as what the administration has already done. Joining me here, John Dickerson, Gayle King. I want to get each of your take, John.
Well, I think if you look at the global situation, the Trump-Pence campaign is in a difficult spot. The polls are going in the wrong direction. Joe Biden is competing in states where Donald Trump should have it locked up. Donald Trump is personally sick and had a bad first debate. So in that environment, Mike Pence did well. His boss will be happy. You mentioned the interruptions. They were mostly on the Pence side, almost entirely on the Pence side, but he did a kind of slow jazz version of interruption as opposed to Donald Trump's version. Yeah. And he didn't answer, as they'll teach you in debate school, you answer the question you want to, not the one that's asked. The question is whether his performance keeping the issue on the economy, attacking Joe Biden, all of which may have scored him points in the nanosecond. The Biden campaign had a helper on the stage, two pieces of plexiglass, which are there because of the ongoing pandemic. And that is the bigger story that exists outside of this debate stage tonight. And so that is something we need to keep in mind when we think about the debate and the larger story going on.
I think many people are wondering why Mike Pence was even on the stage. If you listen to the CDC rules, you're not even supposed to be in contact with other people when you've been exposed to someone who has coronavirus, which we know the president does. But I thought Susan Page set the tone very early when she said, listen, the American people deserve to have a conversation. They deserve to have a civilized conversation, which I think for the most part we did. But a couple of times, many times, I kept thinking, I wish there were thought bubbles so we could see what they were each thinking, because many times, more on Mike Pence's side, I have to say, where he didn't answer the question, he would pivot to something else. There was at one point where Kamala, when he was asked a question directly about social distancing, and at the White House Rose Garden, and you could see Kamala's face like, yeah, now what are you going to say? At one point when they were talking about systemic racism, I think it's very interesting timing that a fly would land on Mike Pence's head at that particular time when he said that there really wasn't systemic racism. I saw the fly basically go and say, what? I mean, it was very interesting. That was, I don't want to call that a highlight, but that was certainly a memorable moment. And the moment with a young girl, Brecklin Brown, we will all know who she is by tomorrow. And the question that she asked, if you all can't get along, how can we get along? I think that's a very important question.
But Mike Pence was masterful. You may not agree with anything this administration does, but in terms of his debating style, he repeatedly did not answer the question that was posed to him about the record of the Trump administration on a number of issues. He pivoted and used the time to deliver a direct attack against against Joe Biden's long record in Washington. And I was stunned because I thought that Kamala Harris, the former prosecutor and skilled debater, from many of the primaries, would be able to make sure that it was the Trump record that was on defense. And many times it seemed like Kamala was on defense.
I think she was trying to follow the rules, though. I mean, I think she was paying attention to uninterrupted conversation, keep on your time cues, and he did not do that.
So the question is, and sometimes in these debates, it's just the turf you own is more important than whether your answer makes any sense. And Mike Pence was very good, particularly in the economic section, talking about taxes and trade. If only the candidate at the top of the ticket had the discipline that he has. And that's the trouble and always been the challenge for the Trump campaign. We can talk to Reince Priebus about that later. And so, the second thing about Mike Pence is, as any of us who've interviewed him know what it's like, it's sometimes difficult. He is very assertive, but is assertion what is needed for the campaign, or is persuasion? He can assert to the crowd that they've already got, but the president needs to do well with the voters he's been shedding. And you can't do that just with assertion.
Our team was following it very closely, and the Vice President, Mike Pence, interrupted Senator Kamala Harris twice as often. She interrupted her. The Vice President interrupted Senator Kamala Harris 10 times during this debate, when suburban women are certainly a key constituency. Does that matter, or the content of what was said? Certainly in this debate is that issue. I want to bring in Nicole Killian.
I think people understand if you want to finish a thought. I think everybody gives you a pass on that, but many times he finished that thought and then kept going. A few times I was thinking, this is a very long 2 minutes. Very long 2 minutes that is happening here.
Right, but he interrupted her.
Yes, I heard him. I heard him.
Let's bring in Nicole Killian, who is at the debate site. And Nicole, your take.
Well, look, I think it was interesting from a number of standpoints. One notable moment came towards the end of the debate where the senator did not answer the question with regard to the issue of court packing. That is something that we saw in last week's debate as well, when the former vice president was pressed on that issue in light of the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, and whether or not Democrats, if they are to win in the election, if they would then try to pack the court, depending on how this all plays out. And so this is actually something that I put to her chief of staff earlier today, if we would get a clear answer from the senator on this. And clearly she did not, but she did stand her ground on the issue of race when that came up. She was very clear as far as calling out that moment last week with the president when he did not denounce white supremacy. Also really taking the vice president to task on the issue of the pandemic. I did speak to one of her close friends towards the end of the debate who said she believes that the senator displayed true leadership tonight.
And good evening once again from New York. Lester Holt along with Savannah Guthrie. The end of a 90-minute debate between Vice President Mike Pence and Senator Kamala Harris. Fair to say a lot of people holding their breath after last week, wondering what the tone would be in this debate. Largely civil, Savannah Guthrie. It's not without its moments, but we certainly got a chance this time to hear from both of them and take a measure. And the question perhaps right now, not who won or lost, but who did what they had to do under the circumstances.
Well, tonight we had a debate as opposed to a debacle. And for that, I think a lot of Americans are breathing a sigh of relief. A lot of different topics covered. And it was mostly civil. There was some back and forth, but substance was discussed. COVID was discussed. The Supreme Court. A lot of talk about manufacturing and jobs. It's a real tell that this battleground, this campaign is being fought in the industrial Midwest. I want to bring in Chuck Todd. Chuck, as you watched tonight, and Lester's question is spot on, who did what they had to do? And did they both do what they had to do?
Well, I don't mean to do a cop-out here, but that's where I was going to land, is you could tell they both sort of had a game plan, and I think they both executed their game plan. The question is whether it's going to move the needle at all. I mean, if you want to get into, I thought Kamala Harris got off to a little bit of a slow start, but I thought she really got her sea legs, got comfortable, and got strong. And look, Mike Pence did a lot of evading and deflection. He was dealt a tough hand, as we said at the beginning, with the virus and where things are. And look, I think there are some in the Trump campaign are going to be pleased with how he deflected and how he evaded. But there are going to be some people who are frustrated about the constant amount of time that Mike Pence avoided answering a direct question. Now, there is a direct question issue for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. It is one that they seem to not want to deal with, which is the Supreme Court question about expanding it. But that was one thing that jumped out at me at this debate was, again, it was clear that was Mike Pence's plan. Deflect some of these attacks. Don't get bogged down in the details. But I wonder if the evasion started to wear thin with some viewers.
Let me go to Andrea Mitchell. I know you were feverishly taking notes through all of this. What stood out to you, Andrea?
Well, I think that Kamala Harris really did warm up and hit her points on white supremacy, on climate, certainly on COVID, pre-existing conditions. She managed to get through and speak directly to the camera and was a very effective debater. Mike Pence was effective in defending President Trump and dodging the questions, an artful dodge, if you will, because he didn't respond to the failures of the coronavirus task force that he leads, which have been very well documented by insiders, by the audio tapes from Bob Woodward. He basically said that, accused her of attacking the American people for their response to the pandemic. But, you know, if you are a supporter of the Trump-Pence agenda, you believe that he did a very good job, and he certainly filled the time and got a lot more time by talking over the time limits. And Susan Page, I think, did a really good job of trying to hold them to a format.
Chuck, I also thought that Mike Pence, landed some punches, but unlike his boss, did it with a velvet glove. So that, it was a different style, but he certainly took it to the Biden-Harris team.
No, I agree, and that's what he does well, and it's when he was at his most effective. It was in fact, he was very effective at almost avoiding a question, avoiding a response, and then just going right back on offense, trying to land a policy hit. So, look, I agree with that. I think he did best when he was talking about Biden's record. Where he struggled is when he was having to defend the Trump record. And I think that was, and I think with Kamala Harris, I would argue that I think she struggled at times trying to defend some of Biden's record or defend the ticket. She was obviously much more comfortable prosecuting a case against the Trump administration.
I'll tell you, one of the things that struck me, I felt like the coronavirus, a lot of the talking points were left on the table, given especially what we have seen over the last 4 or 5 days involving the president. I don't know if anybody else.
Lester, I had a feeling that I felt like there was a little bit of eggshell walking on that. I think that because of how personal it is, I noticed that too. And this was part of me that thought, you know what, they don't want to go there right now.
But I also thought, Lester, that there have been so many things said by the president in the video tonight, in the video when he first came back, not wearing a mask. I was surprised that the whole issue of masks didn't come up because the vice president talked about mandates, but it's the advice of their own public health officials and their refusal to wear masks and all the things that they've been justly criticized for, him taking off the mask when he first came back to the White House. I was surprised that did not come up and that she didn't score on those points.